Greetings, conservatives. Welcome to ConservaCast episode 2. This is John Moraga. I have got a lot on my mind today, and hopefully you'll allow me a little bit of wiggle room to venture into a few of my thoughts here. I'd like to start off by addressing this probably oversaturated story now of Harvey Weinstein. And that's not to undermine the severity of it, but I'm sure you, everywhere you've turned or looked, you may have heard of this story. So I don't want to tell you something you may not already know or maybe have anticipated. In fact, I think I have a pretty unique insight into this. And if you've listened to the first episode, which I encourage you to do if you haven't, you know that I was in the industry as a teenager and joined the union at about, I think 16 it was. And so I got fairly well involved in the industry, never made it quite as big as I had set out to. But that being said, I had, let's say, a very similar but different experience. Now, I don't want to break some news story here that I knew Harvey Weinstein. I never knew the guy, I never met him, I never worked with him. So I'm not trying to make some direct association to this story. What I want to do is just kind of tell you a little bit about what may have happened a number of years ago to me personally while I was in the industry. And just to kind of shed some light that I could pretty much guarantee you may not have heard thus far, at least not nearly as often. Not only is this story something that is pretty well known in the industry, there are a lot of other cover-ups. And to many of you who might hear this, it's not a surprise. It's not something that's shocking. Oh my goodness, there is a cover-up and scandal in Hollywood. Big news. I mean, that's not something that should really rock somebody's boat or make somebody fall back in their chair to think. So there's something, at least in my opinion, a little bit fishy about this story. And not that it should not have been broken. By all means, it should have been. But I just find it a little bit interesting that this person was targeted, that it was as, I guess, coordinated or a bit of a sting as it was. I almost am waiting for Harvey Weinstein to turn around and possibly blow the lid off of others who were either directly involved with him or that he may have known about who have done similar things and who had done them for some time. I mean, and that's possibly why it was never exposed, more than likely, because he probably does have a lot of dirt on so many other people and on so many other things. You could even see it among the people who have tried to cover their own behinds or cover for him or just themselves personally, whether it's Ben Affleck or Matt Damon or George Clooney. I mean, there are a number of people who have tried to make statements as though they didn't know, or if they did, they tried to, they didn't know to what extent it was. I don't know what their story or excuse may have been or be, but it doesn't really sounds so credible. So, I think Harvey Weinstein may be waiting to see exactly how far this might go, how far people may take it, and who may come to his defense, and whether he may even be able to avoid a full prosecution because of how much publicity it's gotten now. I mean, what district attorney is now going to be willing to be compromised in the face of such public scrutiny to cover for him or not be as across the board with any implication of legal justice? So I don't know, but there still may be. I've been shocked before, and I wouldn't be surprised to be shocked with how there may be even further corruption between those in power and our legal system. So that's not to sound overly cynical. That's just to be realistic about what may be the outcome of any type of prosecution that Harvey Weinstein may face. That being said, I want to get back a little bit to my own personal experience, as I said. Now, if you have young ones around, or if you yourself are pretty young, hopefully not, I would strongly suggest either lowering the volume, or perhaps just possibly tuning back in a few minutes later, or unfortunately, although I would prefer you to continue to listen. If you choose not to, I understand. But I'm going to be discussing a topic that isn't exactly the most comfortable for a lot of people. I'm not going to be graphic. It's just, for myself at least, it's quite uncomfortable, but also I think necessary in light of what's been going on with this story. So I've really been conflicted of how to even approach this, and as you can tell, it's hard to even begin. But in 1997, I had already been pretty much signed up for the Air Force and had gone through all of my initial screening and MEPS and pretty much ready to go. But I still had to graduate high school and finish my classes. And at the same time that I was in high school, I was still filming various TV shows and movies, and one of them happened to be a movie entitled Apt Pupil. Just as an extra, of course, I didn't have any starring role. It was directed by a director who is pretty well known now, especially for directing the X-Men. I believe it's a whole series, if I'm not mistaken. His name was Bryan Singer. Apt Pupil was a film adaptation of Stephen King's novel of the same name. And I had never read the book, so I wasn't too familiar with the storyline. But apparently, just knowing Stephen King, I was anticipating that it might be quite a different type of movie. So, and what I recall of the experience was being on location. Location is what they call it when you're not on the studio, you're not on set. And so we were out at this school, and we were in this locker room. And I just remember having a request to take off our shirts in this locker room. Now, let me back up a little bit. Typically, the way that you go onto set, or you go, especially as a minor, and obviously anything under 18 is considered a minor. So usually what happens is you get introduced to the AD, the assistant director, and they're basically your floating guardian while you're filming and shooting and doing things, or your point of contact, because your actual guardian, whether it's your parent or your legal guardian of any relation, they're usually at a specified location, and sometimes they're even permitted to just kind of go about the studio and come back at a certain time. But for the purposes of filming, they're not within your immediate vicinity, typically. And so you become familiar with this one person who is the assistant director, who will tend to you and answer your questions, etc. And so basically, after being released from our guardians, we were handed over to the assistant director. We were told to go into this locker room. And while we were in the locker room, we were like, okay, well, here's what basically the scene is supposed to be. You kids in this locker room, and you're supposed to be interacting, and just kind of a background scene. And there weren't really any lines as much as we were supposed to provide the scenery, so to speak, the extra work, the background. Now, typically, especially preparing to go into the Air Force, I wouldn't have had a problem with being asked to take off my shirt, remove my shirt. And so when the assistant director, or however, it got handed down to that person to ask us to take off our shirts, remove our shirts, it didn't seem so odd initially. But then I started thinking almost immediately after that, this is going to be on film after all. And as anxious as I was, as eager as I may have been to break through into the industry, and although I had already signed up for the Air Force and was already committed, as eager as I was, and hoping for that one slim shot, it still dawned on me, do I really want to be exposed like this, even as a man, as a boy, male, forever? I mean, this is the film. I mean, and especially if essentially I'm getting paid the rate that I was as a minor, as in this extra role. I don't know that I necessarily feel comfortable just exposing myself on camera for the sake of just exposing myself. Now, that just may have been my own modesty at the time, or however I may have felt. But again, I was toggling between, well, I still want to do this, but I don't know how comfortable I feel with it. But I okay, well, maybe we will. But before I had to actually follow through with making that decision, they held the filming for what seemed to be, a few minutes, then a few hours, and then eventually we were basically told to go home. We'd get paid, but basically we would be sent home. Shortly after that, my dad had told me or asked me a few things and questioned me about a few things and wanted to know some things without being prompted, of course. And so when I had mentioned that the guardians were usually at a designated area, I think if my dad may have been privy, because he was the one who was with me there at the time, if my dad had been privy to this request, he may or may not have been the actual guardian who had complained about the situation. And so before I start going all over the place, because it does stir some pretty old scars, at least 20 years now, that, at least for me, it really disillusioned my perception of Hollywood and the industry, and my desire to really even be as big of a star celebrity. 17 isn't that young, but it's still young enough that it felt as though there was a lifetime of aspiration that had been essentially kind of burst within the moments of a few revelations, so to speak. Basically, what had happened was there was one of the other young boys who I think was only about 14. And his parents, guardians, or whoever it was, had caught wind of this. How? I don't know. I don't recall. Again, because typically the guardians are usually at a designated area, or they're usually floating around at some other few places. So that may have been what had happened. Maybe they happened to stumble upon the actual filming of it and weren't supposed to be there. Who knows? But however they caught wind of what this request was before it had actually taken place, I'll never know. But basically, they had raised some concerns. Once they had raised some concerns, there was a few more inquiries. And from my recollection, I'm not sure if I was questioned at the time there or if my dad had questioned me later. it got a little bit fuzzy. All I remember was having that request made, being in the locker room, contemplating whether or not to do it. And before I could make that decision myself or talk to anybody, it was basically told, cut, go back to the smorgasbord of what they had for food to munch on until we got further direction. It made me really reevaluate so many of the other previous things that I had possibly just ignored leading up to that, and other instances that occurred. Eventually, that other young boy's parents filed a lawsuit against the director and the production company, I believe, which was ultimately dismissed for lack of evidence, surprisingly, and perhaps there was maybe no ill intent. But that's assuming a lot. That's assuming quite a lot when there were so many other times leading up to that as I looked back on it then, and as I tried to look back at it decades later, I had been so exposed to a lot of possibilities of being taken advantage of that my parents would have never known about. They would have been completely oblivious. It could have happened, and it would have been so pushed under the rug, so covered up, so hush-hushed, that because of my eagerness as a young child, 15, 16, even up to 17, to want to be as successful and to have as big of aspirations as I did, is a prime recipe when added with a power-hungry producer, director, or group of people. It's just when one party is already susceptible to want to be open, and another party preys on that desire and naivete, that's a very dangerous combination. And that's essentially the formula and the equation of Hollywood. It's not absolute, it's not across the board, because it's not overwhelmingly in your face and obvious. It's just disgustingly a very large percentage. Thank God. Thank God nothing serious happened to me. Physically, at least, or sexually. But that was the tipping point, I think, for me. I don't think, I know. It was a tipping point that so many little things that I had seen and witnessed from 15, 16, 17, there was so many things that leading up to that one instance that I look back on, and it just made me feel so very dirty, so very, just like there was soot on my memory. And to kind of bring this around full circle to the Harvey Weinstein story, he's in a situation of historically normative sex scandal. A adult heterosexual promiscuous sex scandal. what is not as comfortable to discuss are things such as young boy pedophilia in Hollywood. It's not something that we want to look very closely at because it does make you cringe. It does make you feel uncomfortable. I don't think I ever became so desperate to engage in certain things, which is why I think I left off to the Air Force so soon and shortly thereafter. But again, because I saw firsthand so many others who had that level of desperation to become the best actor of the year, best director, best screenwriter, whatever it was that they were wanting to do and set out to do, which I would have initially been honored to have received. By that time, I was over it. I'd become disillusioned. So thankfully, I was able to avoid being as destroyed and used and manipulated as I otherwise could have been. But I think it still affected me just being as exposed to that potential and the reality of how prevalent it is and just how unchecked it is, how how just kind of accepted and just normative it's made in certain circles. Now again, I don't even think it rises to the level of the majority, but it is such a large percentage that it is disgusting. It is wrong. It is something that should not be permitted to be at any level, but especially at such a large percentage or high prevalence. So when we consider the fact that there is a lot of this outrage for Harvey Weinstein and his scandal, I would like some public outrage or some push to look even further deeper into things that are very similar to what Jerry Sandusky did in Penn State. If you'll all recall that story, when that broke, there was just a national outcry of disgust and outrage. I think if we're consistent, there's far bigger things to uncover than Harvey Weinstein, which is part of the reason why I think this story is a little bit fishy. People have had stories of grown adult heterosexual affairs but we're talking about things that rise to the level of children. There's a movie I'd like to draw your attention to. It's called An Open Secret. Please, I urge you to not only watch this movie, but to share it. Have whomever you share it with their friends and family. This is much bigger than Harvey Weinstein. This is much larger than Harvey Weinstein. I'm not going to develop some conspiracy theory that there's one crazy person or entity out to get Harvey Weinstein. I'm just saying it's just a little fishy that they're going after this one guy who's done something that is pretty prevalent in the industry. But not only is this prevalent, more disgusting things are prevalent. And they're covered up. This is something that may actually be revolutionary in the industry. Who knows? It may be just a phase that happens. It may just be a blip in Hollywood's history, or perhaps there may actually be a very big change. I know people, specifically Mark Levin, have called for stronger criminal investigations into Harvey Weinstein specifically, but just as a whole, into Hollywood. I would love for there to be actual government funds invested into prosecuting and at the very least investigating how these different types of networks operate, how they're able to be as secretive and just gone unchecked, and how it's gone on for so long. Again, I thank God I wasn't extremely harmed, and I don't have very large scars that I reflect on. But I just know how easily I could have, and how many others were easily duped into or taken advantage of doing things such as that. I don't know. That's kind of what I've got to say on that issue. That's quite a bit, actually. So, without getting too far into psychoanalysis and venturing into other little chambers that are unnecessary to venture into, we all have some little rooms we may not otherwise want to revisit, at least not on a group setting. Now, moving on, there is a few other things I want to cover at least briefly before I wrap this up. I know I spent most of the time discussing that, but I think some of you may find that interesting, and hopefully, if not interesting, at the least encouraging you to pass it on to others. I wanted to address something that got a little bit of attention briefly, but the news cycle moves so fast, we tend to forget some of the highlights. And so I just want to draw back to something that happened a few weeks ago. There was a general from the Air Force who spoke out about somebody who posted or sent some type of message that was a racial slur. And he had basically, in summation, said, if you can't get with the program, get out. Get out of the Air Force, get out of the military. This isn't for you. If you can't respect somebody of a different race, of a different color, you need to leave. You need to move on. This is not for you. He said it best himself. I'm not going to try and repeat him. I won't do him justice in what he said. But basically, some of you may be very familiar with that story. Again, my own personal experience in the Air Force has shown me that I can't think of a place in our society where there is more equal opportunity across race and gender than the United States Air Force. I can't think of a better place that has more equal opportunity than the United States military as a whole. But I think specifically the Air Force does an outstanding job demonstrating an inclusive operating force that has really no color boundaries, no gender boundaries. I think if there are probably, how do I want to say this? I think within the top 5 things that I would attribute to the best things that I would give to the Air Force, equal opportunity is somewhere in those top 5, if not the top 3. I'm not going to list them now, but just the fact that I had been extremely impressed with how above and beyond they made efforts to make every race feel equal and comfortable, and how much they went out of their way when there was even a hint or a suggestion of any type of discrimination. It just, I unparalleled. Before I went in and since I've been out, I have seen nothing come close to meeting that. It is one of the things that the military as a whole prides itself in, but again, I think the Air Force does a phenomenal job doing that. And so when this general came out and gave this speech, it struck a chord of pride that I had not felt for a very long time. Now, that's not to mean that I'm not patriotic by any means, obviously, but I think this in particular brought me home to the Air Force in particular, because it just was a reminder of how great of an institution it is, and how it was very reminiscent of that Air Force culture when that general was as fierce and passionate by giving the ultimatum: either get with the program or leave. This isn't for you. That's the Air Force I knew. That's the Air Force that apparently is still around and kicking, and as fabulous as it is. So I just wanted to revisit that story for a moment, because I wanted to talk about it when it had initially come out, but we were getting a number of things together, and then very quickly the news story changes, so I didn't have a moment to address it. But if you haven't had a chance to see that video, I would encourage you to do so and get a little taste of the awesome job that our military is still apparently doing, and providing the best possible defense that we could have. So that's the second topic that I wanted to kind of address briefly there. And what I want to kind of wrap up with here is what we're putting together is a very unique webinar series. Now, when I say unique, people, I am serious. This is something I don't believe I have stumbled upon anybody else doing, and I at least from my research, I've yet to see anybody else really trying to do it, especially this specific and tailored. What we're going to be doing, without revealing too much of it, we've gotten together with some certified educators, actually from a few different states, and we're fine-tuning specific curriculum in order to give effective tools for various levels of education and understanding. And so by working with them and coordinating with them, we're able to kind of incorporate these different deep philosophical ideas of conservatism and life, etc., without getting too far into the woods of the depths of the philosophy. Now, that doesn't mean that we're trying to shy away from that. No, what we want to do is provide a baseline for those who may just be generally curious about politics and philosophy and this thing called conservatism, to where once we're able to provide them some baseline, we want to go ahead and direct them to other resources, some other well-known names that might be out there, and their books and their videos, etc. And so we're not trying to necessarily compete with so many different other conservative voices out there, as much as, in fact, trying to help give those people even more of an audience, ironically. The objective is to kind of reach out to as many people as possible and give them some reason to research conservatism, whether it's something simple or something more complex and deep to research. So this webinar series is going to try and focus on how to best approach that. And obviously nothing is going to reach 100% or nothing's foolproof, but our hope is that by incorporating certified educators and different resources, we are able to provide the largest audience with a basic to intermediate understanding of conservatism, so that they can then take those tools and resources and do further research, and perhaps even become part of an audience of other conservative voices. So again, we're not really trying to necessarily take the market from others or impede on anybody else's business or audience, as much as trying to enhance them. So that's one of the major things we've got coming up. We've actually have one other really big thing coming up, really big thing. And I'm just going to leave you with that, a little bit of a cliffhanger that I am not permitted to discuss further details on. And although I may have the loudest voice of Conservatives Corner, I am not the only person of Conservatives Corner, contrary to popular belief. So that, I believe, wraps up today's rant. I appreciate you joining me once again. I look forward to hopefully bringing you another ConservaCast next week. Of course, pre-order your copy of our upcoming mini documentary launch. As I said before, we anticipated coming out winter of 2017, possibly early 2018, still winter. And if you don't order it now, if you don't pre-order it now, the price will go up substantially once it is released. So just to give you a heads up, you may want to check that out at conservativescorner.com/order. conservativescorner.com/order.